See, I used to save all these. I've noticed these trees out here and these hills and back in there. There's some trees I purposely wouldn't get because I wanted to grow for another 20 years. You can't go to Menards or Home Depot and get some of the traditional materials that we need. They don't stock birch bark. They don't stock these roots or the pitch or the weegoob or the black ash. Or one of my passions is Wigwassa Jiman. That's right here, birch bark canoe. And what I what I mean about a passion in building these canoes, it keeps me connected to the earth. It keeps me connected to something that's real, meaning something that's alive, and everything in the canoe comes from the earth. Somebody asked me, how long does it take you to make a birch bark? How long does it take to make a birch bark canoe? And I tell them it takes 70 years. It takes 70 years to make this birch bark canoe, or maybe 50. I'll bring it down to about 50 years. It takes 50 years to make this birch bark canoe. The world that I see right now is changing. It's changing. Changing. When I was as old as him, I remember going out places in the woods. When I was old as Talon, 14, I have never seen a birch tree die. When I was old as Talon, never seen it. Go out in the woods and you could just see it that it was healthy. So since I was 14 to today, and I'm 58 today, I think. Maybe I'm 59, I just had a birthday, that's right. Since that time, I've noticed a tremendous change. When I had to go out and get this birch bark here for this particular canoe, I had to look at 1,000 trees. And probably half of them trees, or a quarter, more than about 40% of them trees were dead. So one day I went out in the woods gathering birch bark, and I get so, you can just glance, you get so used to the woods and what you see, you can just glance if that tree is good or that one's good, just by the color, by what have you. So I seen this one tree look really nice, and I went right to it, and I started cutting. It wouldn't pop, and I looked up, and no leaves on it, dead. That 25 years ago, and I don't know what it was. Something just overcame me. I don't know what it was. Just like a emotion, or it just knocked me right on the ground. And I started crying like a big baby. Grown man crying. I don't know what it was. I remember seeing raindrops right on the leaves. There'd be little marks on there sometimes. I remember seeing that in the woods. And part of that is mercury. Part of the reason why them trees are like that is pollution. Part of the reason why is, there's many things that we already know why things are changing. And a lot of that's from man-made. Here's my prediction. Birch bark canoe building is on the verge of extinction. This is on the verge of extinction. Birch trees are dying. They're dying. They're dying left and right. Here in Red Cliff, within the past, I'd say 1,000 trees a year are dying every year. 1,000 trees.
I feel as though the change of the trees, like the trees dying, will affect us if we don't do anything about it. Because without like all the trees, all the birch trees, we wouldn't be able to make beautiful like canoes.
I believe that the rapid rise in migration of invasive plant species such as buckthorn, honeysuckle, and wild parsnip is related to climate change. Our boreal or northern forests, which are the species of balsam fir, black spruce, white spruce, quaking aspen, paper birch, are expected to decline and move further north into Canada.
Every species has its unique history and responses, and paper birch certainly does too. The biggest thing about paper birch that we've seen is really a huge decline in general in the northern region, northern Wisconsin, over the last, even starting 30, 40 years. Basically, most of the extensive paper birch stands are a legacy of big fires, and those trees are now mature and have been mature for a while. So it hasn't been possible to really harvest them at a high enough rate, and so we're seeing a lot of those decline. So it's a combination of the age of the trees, periodic droughts, which possibly have been a little more frequent in the last few decades, and the fact that they're also, once they're weakened, there are other insects and diseases that also then have an opportunity to affect them. I don't know that acid rain is a particular problem at this time. It's relatively lower than it was some decades ago. Cumulatively, it still could have an effect because it does continue to add nitrogen to the soil, and that certainly has effects on nitrogen cycling. And paper birch could be particularly sensitive to that. If we're seeing unusual effects on leaves, of course, those kinds of things could be different kinds of diseases. It also could be ozone damage. That's another possibility. But it's the kind of thing you'd have to really look at the material to see what it is. Paper birch in general is a very light demanding species. Paper birch and aspen are the two species that often seed into wide open areas after fire. And those are the kinds of conditions it needs. I think in relation to climate change, the strategies stay the same. You need to either clear areas, and you can sometimes grow it by coppice, which means if you cut larger trees, they'll resprout to multi-stem trees. Some of it can be managed that way. Sometimes those then are not as vigorous as original trees. So the strategy for paper birch is still, ideally, it's both clearing and fire to prepare open seedbed. And those are particularly challenging whether you have climate change or not. If we have more periods of warmer weather and therefore more dryness, that can become a problem with seedling establishment. And I don't think really right now that there is a strategy that we can use to address that if that happens in particular. It's in a sense, it's not that different from just the variability that we see year to year. And there are some dry years and some wet years, and they correspond in different ways with good seed crops. It's something that's very hard to incorporate into management.
I went too long ago that's the shortest goddamn sugar bush season I ever seen in my life. It was probably 5 or 6 years ago. 1 week, done. I remember we were out there and I was collecting sap in shorts. It was 80 degrees. And never. Short, just like that. Bam, done. Maybe we have to learn how to adapt. Or maybe learn how to maybe do different things. Like, for an example, sugar bushing. I've heard, I don't know for sure, but I've heard, because we got sugar maple, I heard that that red maple is more conducive to warmer climates. That's what I heard. Red maple is. Well, I like to know for sure. You know, for so that we could still tap the trees and still do them things, but you know, it ain't gonna be sugar maple because the climate's gonna affect the sugar maple, but maybe the red maple.
I mean, the main thing I've seen is just the weather patterns are really inconsistent. So the trees don't know when spring is coming. They don't know when winter is coming. Some of the trees have genetic timers on them. Like oaks are more likely to put out leaves and lose their leaves at the same time every year, where others are more regulated by the temperature, like maples and elms. So, you know, it's especially the trees that are regulated more by temperature as far as when they do their spring thing. Those trees are getting confused and they're losing leaves at the wrong time of year and putting them out before they're ready. Like I was saying, right now the maples think it's sugar season, and the flower buds are swelling well before they should, and those trees are going to be very disappointed in a week or two when it starts getting to be Wisconsin February again, and that's just not good for the trees.
I can tell you that from my just doing maple syrup, from being a young child all the way through to my adulthood and where I'm at right now in my life, there's definitely been a change in climate. The best conditions for maple syrup, for sap to flow, is freezing temperatures at night and warming in excess of 40, 45, even 50 degrees during the day. So if you have that fluctuation of those temperatures, you get a better flow of the sap. So now, in the last 15 years, we've seen just a real flat line with regard to the temperature. It might hover around freezing, 30 degrees, and it might climb to 40 degrees or even 45 degrees, but it never gets down to the temperature where the sap really, really freezes down tight and then releases. And that's the best scenario for making maple syrup and collecting sap. So what we get is we get just a continual drip, 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 drip. So like when I was young, we'd hear the cans going ping, 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 ping. That's when you have a run. Ping, 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 ping. And we don't hear that anymore. It's drip, drip. And that's been that way. So like when I was young, we would collect sap in the morning and we'd collect sap in the afternoon. Now we just collect sap in the afternoon. And sometimes, like we'll run out and we'll collect it maybe every other day, maybe sometimes 3 days. So that's really changed a lot. We got little sugar bushes all over. People tapping trees by their houses. 10 taps, you know. You can make maple syrup. It's good. Education. Teaching the little kids. People down at that early childhood center going out making syrup. Programs that I used to work with, we did sugar bush. So other families, they start to realize that, hey, we can do this. We can do this and go out and do it and then enjoy doing it, you know, and coming out with a finished product.
A lot of others, I don't know that we've seen a lot of impact so far on sugar maple. There may be at most some suggestions. It's one of the most mesic species in the state. That is, it really likes moist conditions, but it doesn't like it too wet, kind of a Goldilocks species. And so it is one that can be sensitive to climate change and a more summer drought. Another possibility is what might happen with snow cover, because actually it's possible that we could end up with less snow cover or really variable weather, that we have melting in the summer, maybe lose our snow cover in some places where we don't typically. And then if there's cold weather again without that protection, the fine roots of sugar maple can be sensitive actually to freezing, which is kind of surprising because we think of it as a northern tree often, although it's all over the state. But in fact, that is something that it's sensitive to, and it's something that we have to keep an eye on, I guess, if we start to have that kind of variability in the future. With sugar maple, for example, unlike the paper birch and the black ash that we talked about, it's very much a shade tolerant species. So it grows in very different conditions, and it needs the protection of, it does better with the protection of some shade rather than being in the open. So sugar maple could be particularly sensitive in the future to stands that maybe the way we harvest them now, historically we've opened the canopy to a certain percentage, and that successfully reproduces sugar maple. That may become a narrower window. If we have drier conditions, we may not be able to open the canopy as much in that harvesting as we have in the past. So that's something that's just speculative. It's a possibility that seems logical that it might occur. So it's the kind of thing that managers could look for, I guess, and it's the kind of thing that managers might experiment with. The other idea is the assisted migration, where we might look for sugar maple that occur quite a bit further south, where we think genetically they're better adapted to warmer conditions, and we might try to move that genetic material in planting further north. But that's risky too, because like I said, the kinds of stresses that we might see with climate change might not be simply that it's warmer, but it might be that we have this problem of losing snow cover and freezing roots in the winter. And so if we bring more southern genetic material further north, they're going to be more sensitive to that kind of winter damage. So it isn't clear that's the simple solution that would necessarily work in this condition. And I think sugar maple is a good example then of why we need to be cautious. It's not just so simply that it's going to get warmer, so if we move trees that are growing further south, that will solve the problem. Red maple, again, is its own special case. It's extremely abundant. It's abundant across the state. It's very abundant in the north on dry sites, but it's what we call bimodal. It also occurs in lowland, swampy areas with black ash. And it's also very abundant in the north and very abundant in southern Wisconsin. And it's really increasing a lot in southern Wisconsin. It's invading oak woods, for example, where there's been less fire. Right now, it's maybe decreasing somewhat in northern Wisconsin as a lot of hardwood stands undergo succession and they move more towards sugar maple, for example. But if we look at what our modeling suggests is that red maple really may be a big winner. If we start having, for example, more disturbance in the north, maybe more wind, maybe possibly even more fire, that would encourage a red maple. And it seems like it does fine in dry conditions as well. If we look at how well it's doing in the southern part of the state, for example. So red maple could be actually a big winner with climate change, and that's not necessarily what everybody wants. They don't really want such a single big winner. Management strategies are what we would use, and what we do use for sort of intermediate shade tolerant species. It likes more openness, more sun than sugar maple, for example, but it can invade under other kinds of species. It can invade under paper birch or aspen, for example. And generally we don't have a problem regenerating red maple. It's more often the other kind of problem, is that we have too much red maple in a lot of situations, both in the north and in the south. But in general, because it seems so flexible, there aren't specific strategies, I don't think, in relation to climate change for red maple.
I've always been told that the black ash, the basket trees, definitely, and black ash as a whole, grows the best in lower lying lands and with lots of water. But I've been seeing a lot of black ash stands, smaller stands, but up on the sides of hills and quite a ways away from the water. A lot of them are younger trees, and then where you go down in the lower lying areas, they're large, very, very big trees. As far as the inventory, I went out in the spring with another couple people, and we just walked. Actually, we had looked at maps that BIA had designated as areas where there might be black ash found. Usually it was just ash as a whole, but it might be in that area. And then our GIS department also went through and gave us spots to check out within our tribal lands. And so after that, we just went out in the woods and walked through all these stands, or hopefully black ash stands, trying to find basket trees. And usually, as far as a basket tree goes, probably 1 in 10 black ash trees are good for baskets. So basket makers are pretty particular on which trees they choose. And I mean, right off the bat, you want a straight tree. I was always told to cut about a 7 to 8 foot log, and then about, I don't know, 6 to 8 inches in diameter, no knots and whatnot, that at least you could hopefully see on the outside. But they used to take hatchets and cut wedges right out of these trees to look at the rings, because it's the rings that make the baskets. And so it is pretty hard on the tree, especially if you didn't choose that one for a basket. But our forester lent us increment borers, and so you can just go core right into the tree and take out a very nice, almost like, it reminded me of those ice cores that you see. And you can see just how wide these different rings are and whether you want it or not, and not as much damage to the tree, so if you don't pick it. Black ash, the tree was given to a woman in a dream, I guess, and that's all we've ever used. And I mean, I won't go into the backstory of all of that, but it's traditionally that's the only tree we've ever used, and throughout the years it's sustained us. I mean, not just having stuff to able to haul around and like every other culture out there creating baskets, but we also people set up basket stands, or they my Choka always, he tells a story about they might have a car payment coming up, and so the family would get together and go all night long, just like a factory line of putting these baskets together, and he'd weave them, and his brother and sisters, and they'd weave them, and then his mom would sort it out and mold it correctly, and they just keep going around until they had all these baskets to take down to Milwaukee or Chicago, and they'd pay off their car payments just like that, doing that. But there was a lot of families all over the place that would set up along the road basket stands, and that's how they made their money. Attended a conference, basket making workshop that Kelly Church out in Michigan put on quite a few years ago, and she brought in scientists, and actually one of the women there was in the group that first discovered the emerald ash borer in Michigan there. And so they spoke, and we've got the basket makers from that area talking about it, as well as the scientists and whatnot that are a big part of it. But when they said that at 80 million trees, dead trees, they had stopped counting, it hit pretty hard, and that was quite a few years ago. She came up this last year to talk too, and basically said they have to go extremely far north to find trees if they're going to find those, and some other drastic things they've had to do to find basket trees for themselves. But as far as my own what I've seen and whatnot, I knew it was out there after that conference and how threatening it was, but I'd done the inventory and gone through, and you could see some black ash trees dying or not looking good, and it wasn't necessarily because of EAB, but there's different splitting of the bark and die off at the top that could be because of the EAB. But it wasn't until after that inventory was done and I'd kind of gone back and just walked through the woods by myself, or not necessarily looking at the basket trees, but in one area you could look, and this was when we inventoried, and we didn't find any basket trees, but there's a lot of black ash there, and you could look over quite a bit of the property and pick out the black ash trees because their trunks were pretty much orange from the woodpeckers and birds going after the bugs inside. Right now, the bug does in the wintertime, it can only take so much cold weather. And so a lot of the forest, black ash up north, far north, is relatively safe, I guess. But with that climate change and, getting warmer and warmer, it's up in the air, I guess. Not who knows when, but, in the future, near future maybe. So it's, when the black ash dies off in this area, that's could be a fallback for us to still find and keep that culture of tradition alive. But with the climate change, that could be gone as well.
We had some severe flooding this summer, and that's unusual for around here. That's usually a springtime event. We had a very moist summer this year, and for some species that's going to lead to more fungal infections, especially leaf problems. The leaves never really dry out, and that gives fungal infections a chance to take hold and to thrive. So when it's too moist, you'd think that trees would love that, but if it doesn't dry out on a regular basis, then fungus, and that's the main killer of trees. Animals don't like bacteria, but trees, their biggest threat is fungus. So extremely wet weather, not good for the trees. Emerald ash borer just hit, it just hit Jackson County about 2 years ago. And we are starting to get mortality this year. South of here on Ho-Chunk lands around Wisconsin Dells, we have a stand of black ash, which is traditionally used to weave baskets. Like this basket right here is made out of black ash. Those stands are dying right now. We help manage some land in the Kickapoo Valley Reserve around Viroqua, Wisconsin, and those trees are very threatened by EAB. EAB is all over Vernon County, and it'll probably hit those trees for sure in the next year. One good thing about the cold weather in Wisconsin, it does keep certain diseases and insects, invasives away. EAB, it comes from a pretty cold region of Asia, so there's some thought that it doesn't get cold enough in Wisconsin anywhere to stop it, but it slows it down because it doesn't have as many life cycles and it doesn't breed as quickly. Native Nations of Wisconsin already have a consortium of foresters. The foresters get together once or twice a year on various projects, and we share information. We've been sharing information about emerald ash borer. We've been sharing information with other nations about some urban forestry techniques. I know Oneida, they have a pretty advanced urban forestry system because they are a pretty urbanized nation as well. I know there's different species. When you get up to Red Cliff, they have completely different types of trees than we generally have. They have northern hardwood, so they have a lot of sugar maple. They'll have the big white birch, and they have different disease and insect issues than we do. And we're able to talk about how we deal with stuff, and it's interesting to hear about what they're doing as well.
Specific climate change impacts on black ash so far are kind of hard to attribute. Black ash has had a number of severe, what foresters call declines in the last 20 years, and it isn't clear what the cause of those is. That could have been drought episodes, for example, something like that. So specifically of ash so far, I don't think we're seeing it yet, but it is a more northern species, so it would be one that we would be concerned about in the future. management strategies for black ash are really going to be challenging. It's a forest wetland species. It grows where it's wet. And so those are difficult systems to manage, especially if we might be facing warmer, drier climate at the same time. The best things would be to encourage or discourage what might be competing species. That would be maybe the safest thing we could do. For example, things like balsam fir or red maple in particular, and those kinds of systems. I think we're going to learn more actually in the next few years. Campus, we have a lot of native ash trees, and those are being cut down, or you see them tagged to be cut down, or you see that on our street trees as well. But we have a few Eurasian ash on campus, and those are the ones that I see they're not declining. Because they're the ones that are adapted to the emerald ash borer that came from Asia. So that's, I think, a good example of how it complicates what we do in the future.